that you would speak through Lion Power in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, hello. You want this on my shirt? How's that? All right, cool. Hi, yeah, we are in Mark again this week. We're in Mark 7, and things are really picking up. Last week, Darby had all the cool stories. So we had the calming of the sea, we had the demon-possessed cast out, the feeding, all that stuff. So things are like really popping off, right? Like Jesus is doing some crazy stuff. If this was like the Fast and the Furious franchise, this week they would like go to outer space and do some stuff, and you can expect something crazy. So let's see. Mark 7 opens with an argument about hand washing. Next, he has an interaction where he infers that this lady who comes to him for help is maybe a dog. And then there's another healing where he grabs somebody's tongue. Okay. Well, let's see what's going on. I want you guys to turn to somebody next to you, read Mark 7 together, and then we're going to get into it. Okay? Go for it. Faster than you. That's okay, though. We will go through this together as well. Okay. So, kind of a weird passage. And maybe you're like, is there even any relation between these stories, right? Like in Mark so far, we've talked a lot about the ways that he weaves stories together, chiasms, the Mark witch, that kind of stuff. What's going on here? Let's start at the top, okay? So why should you care about Jesus and the Pharisees having this spat over hand washing? First, I just want to point out the incredible timing. Like, the last thing Jesus did before this that we know is he fed 5,000 people, like out of nothing almost. And right before that, controlling the sea, huge thing that says, I am Yahweh. This is like the type of the thing that would not be kept secret. It's just impossible to imagine that if one of those 5,000 people would not have just spread this everywhere. So it's probably well known now. There's a very good chance the Pharisees have heard about this, and they are apparently not impressed. They're just ready to throw down about this. So they kind of come indirectly to him this time. Instead of attacking him, point blank or asking him point blank about something he does, he's like, what's up with your disciples? They got these dirty hands and you're just hanging out, not worrying about it. And so, kind of a fair question, because, if my son comes to the dinner table and hasn't washed his hands after doing a bunch of stuff, then I'm worried. But the Jewish people, okay, so let's talk about this. The cleanliness laws and stuff around cleanliness, that was taken very seriously. It even points that out in Mark. This was something that everyone observed. I think that's a little bit hyperbolic, everyone, since they were Jewish and they didn't do it. But either way, this kind of being unclean thing was associated with death and demons, and actually they associated it with like being distant or far from God. And so there was a lot of shame and stuff like that built into this for a lot of people. So think of maybe for you when you watch porn or fall back into smoking weed again or sleeping with, whatever, stuff like that. Whatever makes you have that strong association of guilt and farness and feeling far from God, that might be kind of in the realm of what it would feel like for them to not be in this like cleanliness state that they were trying to get to. So these practices that were around these laws came from Leviticus, the Old Testament, and Mark specifically mentions that people are following them. But Jesus doesn't give a direct answer to their question. To understand his response, I think we need to look more closely at other things that are happening. Specifically, this law in particular around hand washing. So while the Bible did have rules about cleanliness, this specific one about hand washing wasn't in there. It just wasn't. The original law that it probably was built on was in Exodus 30, was that priests, before they went into the tabernacle, had to wash their hands and feet. And so the Pharisees took that idea and made this new rule that all Jewish people had to wash their hands before every meal, not just priests and not at the temple. So the Pharisees would take these laws in the text of the Torah, plus other rules that they created, and use them to make people's spiritual lives kind of unnecessarily difficult. It's like changing the rules in the middle of a game, right? Like imagine playing football and that every time you get close to scoring, the goalposts move. You've heard that saying, moving the goalposts. It's that kind of thing. And this isn't just this situation. In Matthew 23, there's this parallel passage. Jesus just outlines this scathing kind of rebuke of the Pharisees around this very idea. A few things from there, he says they tie up heavy, cumbersome loads and put them on people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to lift a finger to move them. I'm not going to read through all of that, but essentially he's like, woe to you, you have neglected the most important matters of the law. But it's kind of this longer section of Jesus like railing into all these things they did to mess with the law and mess with people's spiritual connection to God. So we have a pretty good reason to think that Jesus has multiple issues around the way the Pharisees use their position and their extra biblical laws to, one, make it harder for people to enter the kingdom and be close to God. But as we see throughout this passage, also it was just outright hypocritical. So I think that should help us get started. And Jesus' answer, okay, so he doesn't actually explain his or his disciples' reasoning to them right away. Instead, he turns the tables and kind of regains command of the conversation first. He quotes something from Scripture, and if you're paying attention last week, it should be no surprise that it comes from Isaiah, right? Our parallel. Isaiah 29:13, these people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain. Their teachings are merely human rules. So he's quoting something from Isaiah that he's saying is prophesying what they would be doing now. So then he piles on. He's like, not only do you do this, you enforce the rules you make up that aren't even from God, but then you break rules that actually are from God when they benefit you. He's like, there was a clear law from God, honor your father and mother. We know that law even said that, cursing your parents in the law was such a serious offense that it was punishable by death. But anyways, a big part of this honoring your father and mother would be taking care of them financially when they couldn't anymore. But the Pharisees found a way around this. They let people say, sorry, mom and dad, I can't help support you because I promised this money as a gift to God instead. So people were breaking God's direct command to take care of their parents by hiding behind this religious custom about donations to the temple, okay? Which, think about where that money that was going to the temple probably would have ended up, right? You can see why Jesus was so scathing. So the Pharisees making an exception to the law, and that has real life consequences for people. For the parents, it means they're left without means to be taken care of. Like families, that was pretty much it. There was not welfare, social security, the safety net, that kind of stuff. So that directly affects other image bearers because the Pharisees are willing to make that loophole. But it also does damage to the person who enters into that kind of loophole stuff with the law too. Like God gave these commands for a reason, for their heart, for them to learn to honor and take care of their parents. And so this is evil. And yet the Pharisees are on Jesus for the hand washing. You can see why he's indignant. But next, Jesus addresses the crowd and he says, hey y'all, come here, listen up. And now he actually does address the Pharisees' question. He says, this is where it would get really wild for them. He not only challenges the validity of the Pharisees' added-on law about hand washing, but the actual food laws from Leviticus 11 and Deuteronomy 14. He says, nothing outside makes someone unclean. It's what comes out of a man. Then I guess he's basically like mic drop and just walks into the house. No further questions. Thank you. Press conference over. And I'm just picturing the disciples are just like wave awkwardly and follow him inside. And then are like, what? What are you doing? Right? And there's a little note. I love that it says they asked him about the parable. They're like, surely this is another one of your cool stories, right? Not you're actually saying our laws are just a sham. And Jesus says, are you so dull? What goes into people doesn't go into their heart. It passes through their stomach and out the other side. Our translations say something like, in saying this, Jesus declared all foods clean. But actually, it's less clear. It's more like it goes into their stomach and out their body, thereby cleansing all foods. So if you want to do a weird dive into what that could mean, go for it. I don't have time tonight. And then Jesus explains what he means by saying what comes out of a person defiles them, which just means that it makes them unclean. So he's saying all this stuff around cleanliness and stuff, I need you to change how you think about it. What actually makes you unclean? The stuff that the law was getting at, what actually causes that uncleanliness state is what comes out from your heart. Evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, etc. He goes on. Those are the evils that come from inside a person and defile them. Okay, so what do we do with all this? I actually think there's a lot for us here. Rhett, my brother, unrelated actually, over at TCU, our staff over there, he did this section on Mark 7, and he talked about how a more literal translation when Jesus says, "You hypocrites," would be, "You stage actors." And at a time, these stage plays that the Romans or Greeks or whoever would wear, they would wear masks that kind of permanently have facial expressions on them to portray things, right? And, being accused of being like a stage actor is like not a nice thing at all, right? Like even now people are like, you're just like acting or whatever, that's not, but even worse, like actors were not like revered and everyone wanted to become famous. It was like actors were not like, anyways, it was not great. One of the podcasts I'm sort of liking right now is called Dissect, and they take this musical albums and they spin an episode on each track of the album. And one of the ones they're doing right now is on Kendrick's album. That's why he's in the corner there, Mr. Morale. And that Mr. Morale album is set up like a play. There's like a narrator, there's different like parts and scenes and stuff like that. And of course, actors. And what Kendrick is trying to do on that album is basically ruthlessly take apart the masks he has worn throughout his life and expose them as a way to deal with the undealt with evil in his heart and the trauma that he experienced in his environment, that kind of stuff. And then he also reflects that back to the culture. That's what that song N95 does, right? The whole take it off thing. And it's a great modern example of this idea of like, there's a lot that we wear in terms of masks, and he's kind of calling back to the culture, like, I'm trying to learn how to take this off, you do it too, yada yada. And that's essentially some of what Jesus is saying here with the stage actors thing. He's like, you hypocrites, you're acting. Let me point out an example, that kind of thing. And so, yes, I think this is important for us. I think there's a lot that can happen in Christian community that mimics this a ton. And yes, focus too. So we should pay heed. What kind of mask do you wear to portray yourself as more on fire for God than you actually are? Are you more bothered by people finding out your sin than you are that you might have broken God's heart or wronged another image bearer? If so, or other things we could talk about, you might be wearing a mask. Because the closer you are to God's heart, the more you'll care about how your sin affects others and the damage it actually does to your heart more than the effect it has on your ego, right? When we operate under a mask, under pretenses, we're mostly concerned when the moment of the mask getting ripped off and the exposure that comes with it. See, God doesn't give us commands just to make us feel good, right? He gives them to help us learn to love each other, to take care of each other, and to tend to our hearts in a way that helps us connect to Him and imitate Him. And so godly sorrow means mourning how our sin disrupts that intention, disrupts what He wants for us, and it's not concerned about feeling bad just because we got caught and are embarrassed. So anyways, despite that reality, we still have to deal with Jesus' handling of the law here. So imagine this law is your understanding of how to be a good Jewish person, to follow God, connect to God, staying away from the things that will keep you apart from Him. And Jesus just comes in and says, yeah, actually, I'm just declaring all that stuff this stuff is clean. And so that's gotta be hard. That's a huge stumbling block for you in following Jesus, right? And I think the key to understanding why He says what He does is around this idea of true purity. Remember the Beatitudes. Blessed are the pure in heart. That is the key. The key is that it doesn't say, blessed are the pure and clean in body. The Pharisees are interpreting God's law to be about surface impurity. Jesus is concerned about the type of impurity that can't be cleaned by washing the hands. He's concerned about the hypocrisy and the evil that the Pharisees do that comes out of a heart that is far from God. So likewise, He's concerned about that kind of evil in our hearts. He's concerned about our purity of heart. He's concerned about the lust we might have for our brothers and sisters, the jealousy over someone else's good that's happening to them, the anger and self-righteousness we feel, etc. That kind of stuff isn't washed off with the mask of keeping Sabbath, fasting, raising our hands in worship. That all just hides what's really going on. So true purity is what He's after, imitating God and looking more and more like Him. But don't get me wrong, and I don't think we should get Jesus wrong. Washing hands is a good practice. It helps prevent sickness. But the problem is when people treat this kind of tradition as if it were a rule from God. When religious leaders force these man-made rules on others, it can cause spiritual harm and it can push people away from God. So to sum it all up, don't practice religion that affects only your hands and not your heart. And we can fall into this. Have you ever made someone feel spiritually less than for not being a Christian in the way you think that they should? Even if that way of being a Christian is more about your ideas and expectations and less about something that God made clear and command. Like, oh, why didn't you come to that worship night? Why not? You have something better to do? Oh, well, I don't think you should go for a job that makes a lot of money. That probably just means you're greedy. Or why don't you spend at least 30 minutes in quiet time every morning? That's how Christians should start their day. Or why don't you keep Sabbath? God told us to keep Sabbath. Okay, so just be really careful with stuff like that. And you got to enter into some discernment and nuance with me here. Is 30 minutes of dedicated time with God in the morning a great idea? Of course, yes. Does that mean it should become a new standard for people to meet or fail? No. This is the kind of discernment we have to enter into. The Bible doesn't say you have to go to all the worship nights, all the spiritual events. Could going to those things really help you and other people connect with God? Yes, absolutely. Are there times where you actually should encourage people to try to connect with God by doing some of those things? Absolutely. Should we try to make it some sort of litmus test for their maturity in faith or their relationship to God? No. That's the difference. And language matters here. Be careful. Does the Bible say no one should make a lot of money? No. Does it warn of the dangers of money and greed? Yes, over and over. Does our culture in particular struggle with greed? Yes. So does that mean we should ask questions when people are pursuing something like that? Yes. But be humble. Help people think through it. Don't make laws that God never gave. You might make someone a really good moralist and a really bad Christian. Okay, next part. Jesus and the Syrophoenician woman. So, weird story. She comes and asks for help with her daughter. Jesus infers she's a dog, basically, and has to wait. What? And people have tried to get around this passage in so many ways. Some of the examples, some people kind of read humor into the text. They're like, he said it, but just like picture the twinkle in his eye, you know? Or they go into the semantics. They're like, yes, he did say dog, but the Greek word is for like a household dog, which everyone loves, not for like a mangy street dog, which is like annoying. It's like, yeah, but like it's still a dog, right? Like it's not that much better. Okay, so let's just note a few things in this section. One, why is Jesus even here? He's in Gentile territory, and not just any Gentile territory, but economically they siphoned off food from Galilee, this particular Gentile territory. So that's kind of interesting. Galilee's where Jesus was from. So in the first place, the Gentiles in this region were viewed as a whole as unclean, right? Going back to the uncleanliness thing. Which remember, for them, is a thing that keeps you distant from God. And on top of that, this bad Gentile city takes food off of your plate, right? And on top of that, he's talking to a Gentile woman, which if you know the context is even of a bigger deal, right? So this brings in how these kind of two seemingly disparate stories connect, I think. Jesus has just got done proclaiming that cleanliness actually comes from either a pure or an unpure heart, not about washing rituals. And yes, you can infer not from avoiding unclean people. So essentially, he's taking this next step and putting his money where his mouth is. He's saying, let me show you. Next thing he does goes directly to the place they would have said was unclean and interacts with those people. So that should clue us in. We're supposed to contrast these two stories, I think, and we should probably contrast the characters that interact with Jesus if we're going to hope to understand some of the meaning. So that leaves us with the contrast of the Pharisees and the Syrophoenician woman. What do the Pharisees exhibit? They exhibit hypocrisy, hard-heartedness, and this stubborn unwillingness to see the miraculous calming of the sea, the feeding of the 5,000, all that stuff, as God at work. They just don't want to see it. Instead, they're obsessed with their rules and proving themselves justified and calling Jesus out. Imagine the heart that stuff comes out of. What does a Syrophoenician woman exhibit? One, she comes to Jesus because she believes he can do this. I think that's pretty likely. You don't break every social norm that's existing to do something like this on a whim or because you think, maybe. I think she believes. I think it's safe to assume she heard about the miracles and this is her responding in faith and hope. Despite her status with Jewish men of the day, she breaches all that and just willingly goes up and asks. Okay, so then what about the rest of the exchange? I think it highlights and further contrasts just how radically different this woman's heart was to the Pharisees. Think about all the stuff we talked about with the heart in the first section. This is like a case study. It's like a tale of two hearts almost, right? The gospel is not just telling but showing, right? The gospel of Mark here. Think about the exchange. Jesus basically insults her, kind of throws a stumbling block in her path. And this is not new to Jesus' MO, by the way. Remember my last sermon up here, we talked a lot about parables and the whole thing, how they were stumbling blocks for people. But it's meant to reveal something in the hearts of the listener and invite them to do what? Does anyone remember what you're supposed to do? Lean in. Great. Lean in. Listen. That's what you do with the stumbling block. And what does this woman do? She leans in. The stumbling block is thrown down, this potentially insulting remark. And what does a prideful, stubborn person do when something like this is said to them? They walk away. They get indignant, they get resentful, and they lean away, right? What does the woman do? She comes back further. She says, yes, but even the dogs get the crumbs. She doesn't argue the comparison Jesus makes. She doesn't assert her identity as a strong, independent Syrophoenician woman. She says essentially, sure, but I'm a beggar before someone such as you, and I'm still asking even though I don't deserve it. Guys, that is a total opposite of the prideful heart of the Pharisees, right? Something about her answer was exactly what our Lord loves to see in people. Rhett pointed out, as far as we know, this is the only time in the Gospels where someone successfully counteracts Jesus and he congratulates them. And I think this is a story for our day because this story says this is the heart that can see and draw close to God and see him actually do mighty miracles. There's something kind of scandalous about the type of faith and yes, the humility it takes to push in at points of pain for especially someone realizing they are nothing in the grand scheme of things and yet still boldly lean in towards that uncomfortable realization. Uncomfortably lean in towards Jesus and ask just for a crumb. So I think the takeaway for us is to ask, okay, what about me? Which one looks more like me? The heart of the Pharisees or the heart of the woman? I think this comes down to pride. And to make it more pointed, maybe this is more specific pride that leads us to entitlement. Do you feel entitled? Do you feel like God owes you? Does he owe you health? Does he owe you a political system that makes your life easy? Does he owe you a spouse? Does he owe you a good paying job? Does he owe you healthy kids? Does he owe you relatives that don't treat you bad? Fill in the blank. You tell me, what does God owe you? What does he owe you after you do everything right? What does he owe you after you wash your hands at the right time every time? What does he owe you after you follow the right laws? Does he owe you more after you do that or less? When's the last time you got mad at God? Over what? Did he owe you something? I'm going to keep saying this in my sermons. We're just beggars, right? That's the point. We're the Gentiles. And yet still our God says, lean in. Come to me, all the meek and lowly. Okay, last story. This is the story of another Gentile man, this in the region of Decapolis, who's both deaf and can't speak. And again, tying back to the first story, here we have another kind of case study, if you will. Jesus and the unclean, him putting his money where his mouth is. And not only does Jesus heal him, but it makes this explicit point of the way that Jesus intimately gets close to and touches this person who is unclean. And we see Jesus, I think one of the coolest parts of the story, he's not unaffected by this interaction. Sorry, I'm so distracted. He's not unaffected by this interaction. Maybe there was something to this unclean law stuff. But anyways, he gives this deep sigh. Mark notes it, And if it's in there, it's important. The word for that sigh he gives is more like a groan, like something is bothering him. And Jesus is interacting with something sad and broken in the world that he created, and he's not unbothered or flippant about it. He gets his hands literally dirty, and he feels it enough to verbally express his emotion during this interaction. And so I just want you to think about this story the next time you see something broken in the world and you want to ask God if he even cares. Our God does care. But anyways, the man is healed. Jesus touches his tongue, with his fingers in his ears. He can hear again, he can speak, and he charges the crowd to keep quiet. Okay, so what do we learn from all these stories? A few reflections to close. We learn that tradition, spiritual practices, and outward markers of faith can mask a lot of things. Tradition, spiritual practices, and outward markers of faith can mask a lot. But let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater here. I don't think Jesus does. He practices silence and solitude. Him and his disciples put aside money for giving. He practices Passover. And Jesus' main issue in the first story is from two disagreements. First is kind of philosophical disagreement about what truly prevents fellowship with God. He disagrees with the Pharisees there. And second, a theological one about how rigid legalism, this kind of thing where they add and then subtract from God's command, that leads to hypocrisy. It leads to separation from God. And in some cases, like the example he throws back at them, it leads to evil. So the Pharisees enforcing these laws actually hindered connection with God. But they did so out of a fear that our defilement would distance us. And we have to realize that traditions, for all their upside, have dangerous potential when they promote something other than God's actual purposes, however well-intentioned those traditions came from. But Jesus says and goes on to show that no matter what practices we recommend, no matter how many spiritual disciplines we master, no matter how many John Mark Comer books we read on formation, no matter how well we keep Sabbath or fast, that none of it keeps you clean. And I realize a lot of Christians, including myself sometimes, are actually kind of practicing what I'll call moralists. I didn't make it up, it's a thing. We're not Christians in that sense. What I mean by that is when you really drill down, we believe that it's what we do that gets us closer or further from God. But guys, that's not the gospel. That's moralism. I do good morals, in return, I get God. I follow the right traditions, follow the right dogma, I get God in return. But guys, I'm in control. And we love to pretend like we're in control. But that's not Christianity. Because God says, I take you, and not because of what you do, but because of what Jesus did, you get to be close to me because of that. And you let me be in control. It's totally different. And this isn't to say what we do doesn't matter. It just doesn't save us. God saves us. What we do, whether Sabbath or worship nights or spiritual practices, all of that stuff can be beautiful and help us live more fully into that reality that is God's kingdom. It's all good formation when done right. Those things can be life-giving and worth doing in and of themselves. But they can't save you. They can't earn you something. They're not transactional. The story of the woman, again, is a case study. If Jesus hadn't said anything, then, all right, thanks for asking. Go ahead and go home, and your daughter is fine. That would have been a cool enough story on its own. It's like, oh, cool, he removed a demon. That's awesome. But that's not how the story goes. He pokes first. And because of that, we get a glimpse into her heart in a way that we wouldn't otherwise. We see that her heart shows humility and expectancy all at the same time, which teaches us something. I think this story is one of the most helpful ones we can wrap our heads around in ministry, because I think it shows us the reality of discipleship. Rhett commented on his part of this saying, this process, it shows us spiritual life, that it isn't here to make us feel good. But we want God to bring us up in the faith and make us feel good the whole time. One of the things I see happen in ministry a lot is when someone is confronted by someone else in the ministry, challenged to grow, some serious defensive-ness often pops up. Sometimes people leave the ministry because someone said something to them that they didn't like, that didn't make them feel good, that was hard to hear, that kind of thing. I get it. Like, I have been there and wanted to turn and run when confronted very often. I think this story is something that we should remember during those times. I think it's here to ask us, how do you respond? Are you like her, accepting that God doesn't owe you, but persistent in still asking and leaning in, seeking him and seeking intimacy? Or do you respond the other way, defensive, stubborn, arrogant, crying out, it's unfair, there's a stumbling block in your path? Guys, God gave you life, salvation, relationship with him, relationship with others. He's committed to restoring you, to helping you grow. Do you think that process works better if he strokes your ego, or if he breaks your ego down to where you can actually see him and hear him? I think, as is hinted at in the last story, all of this ties together. The ones who look to get the ego stroked along the way to feel good, they won't be able to see or hear God very easily. And therefore, when they open their mouth, not much of anything worthwhile comes out. What comes out of the mouth of the Pharisees, right? What comes out of the mouth of the woman, though? And finally, what happens when you let God touch you with his hands and free your tongue and open your ears? You're healed. See, we start stubborn and proud, clinging to our traditions, clinging to what we can control. Then we start to learn to lean in and seek. To lean in despite our feeble kind of meekness, our lowly status, but we still seek. And then what I think comes next is we actually start to hear God. And then we can speak. But now when we speak, it's not our words of the kind of dead rote patterns of the old world that's passing away. But now it comes out of us, it comes out of a different heart. And from the lips of people that God has touched come beautiful words of that God who has touched them. And those words are the words about how he healed us and freed us. And those words can go out and bless the nations. Let's pray. Worship team, y'all can come up.